Before proceeding to the substance of the question, let us first familiarize ourselves with brief information about the achievements of ancient medicine in general. Let us note that Roman successes in this field were inherited from the whole Mediterranean civilization and, above all, from Hellas. At the beginning of the first millennium AD, the main center of medical education was Alexandria, but quite respectable schools of medicine existed also in Gaul and Spain, in Athens, Antioch, Ephesus, Smyrna and Pergamum. Nevertheless, young men from all the provinces of the empire flocked to the Egyptian capital in search of medical education. Even when Egypt was in serious decline, Ammianus Marcellinus wrote that a mere mention of studying in Alexandria was a sufficient recommendation for a physician. This will sound strange, but in those days medical specialization had progressed considerably. No one is able to be a universal physician. Philostratus Flavius the Elder records, there must be specialists in wounds, fevers, eye diseases, consumption. Anatomy of corpses was practiced in Alexandria, and surgery was perhaps as well developed here in the 1st century as in the best European clinics up to and including the beginning of the 19th century. Often the physicians were women. One of them, Metrodora, wrote a surviving treatise on uterine diseases. The history of medicine of that era is adorned with great names. Absolutely phenomenal successes are achieved in gynecology, and it was possible to repeat them only almost 2,000 years later. It was the ancient doctors who invented gynecological mirrors and obstetric chair. Galen, the most famous physician of this period, was the son of an architect from Pergamum. He turned to medicine at 17, studied in Cilicia, Phoenicia, Palestine, Cyprus, Greece, and Alexandria, worked as a surgeon in the Pergamon gladiatorial school, and practiced for a time in Rome. He proved to be a keen observer and experimented more than any other ancient physician. Galen diligently described the structure of the skull and dorsal spine, the muscular system, the mammary glands, and the heart valves. He identified the difference between pleurisy and pneumonia, described aneurysms, cancer, and tuberculosis, revealing its infectious nature. Rome, with its incredibly efficient and successful system of state building, began to care about supporting medical science in the time of Vespasian. When the first departments were opened and teachers were paid a fixed salary, graduates of these schools were given the title of state physician, and only they could subsequently practice within Rome. Many of the state physicians were sent to serve in the army. Thus, we see that, in comparison with later epochs up to the 19th century, antique medicine stood at a very high level, and since Rome fought a lot and almost continuously, the state faced the urgent question of treatment and subsequent return to the ranks of wounded legionaries. The Romans approached this issue with their inherent pragmatism and thoroughness. Medicine in the army. The Romans would never have conquered half of the inhabited world without a clear understanding of the need for strict organization of all government departments. The empire was a complex organism, quite comparable to modern large countries. Since the Roman army was, if you will, the state-forming structure and the most effective military mechanism of the times of antiquity, attention to the provision, supply and construction of the army was given the closest attention. In the Republican period, the army had the form of a people's militia, gathered in case of a military threat from free citizens according to their property value. The situation began to change under the dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla, when a professional army appeared, and in the time before the end of the Civil War and the accession of Octavian Augustus, the evolution of the army was finally completed. The legions, as required by ancient law, were not disbanded after the end of hostilities, and service was henceforth carried out on a garrison basis. Around the time of Augustus, such an important area of military medicine as sanitation was developed. The Romans were already clean, and in a military camp with a large number of people in a limited area, sanitary rules had to be strictly observed. The health of the legionary, and therefore his ability to immediately carry out the order, came first. Officers checked the quality of the food and water supplied. Every little detail was taken into account: toilets, comfort and cleanliness of clothing, veterinary service. All this was under the jurisdiction of the camp prefect. Hygienic requirements for camp arrangement can be found in many Latin authors. Flavius Vegetius Renatus informs us that tents should be placed on a dry and elevated place. In case of cold weather, a stock of warm clothes for soldiers is required. Special attention should be paid to water purity in order to avoid intestinal problems. The wounded and sick are obliged to rest, and therefore the infirmaries should be arranged as far away as possible from the noisy legion workshops where armor and weapons are repaired. Nowadays it is called hearing hygiene or acoustic hygiene, but already 2,000 years ago the Romans understood perfectly well that a legionary tired after a battle should get a good night's sleep and took appropriate measures. Julius Caesar, in his Notes on the Gallic War, does not mention military doctors at all, but there is no doubt that medical support, at least at the grassroots level in his army, was present. At least, every Roman soldier was obliged to carry bandages to provide first aid to a comrade. But this distracted him from his main duty, to fight. What conclusion follows from this? That's right. There should be a specialized service with legion doctors and sanitary teams. It was said, done. The Romans were very quick to introduce useful innovations. By the 2nd century, military medicine reached its antique apogee, turning into a superbly organized structure. Each legion had 24 surgeons. Field medicine and first aid worked almost flawlessly, and there was a hospital near every major military camp. The hospital was called a valetudinarium, from the Latin for health. Valetudinaria, built in the rear and most remote from the enemy part of the camp, served large military formations, usually 2 or 3 legions. The total capacity of the hospital was about 200 beds, that is, about 1 place per 50 legionaries. Nearby was often erected an altar dedicated to Aesculapius, the god of medical art, whose cult penetrated Rome from Hellas. When in the Eternal City there was an epidemic of unknown to us contagion, the Sibylline books then gave advice for the sake of deliverance from the pestilence to bring to Rome a statue of Asclepius of Epidaurus. If at first valetudinaria were wooden, by the 2nd century, the Romans, accustomed to unification and uniformity, began to build standard hospitals made of stone, structures very impressive and equipped with all the amenities available at that time. In the standard form it was a rectangular 1-story building with an inner courtyard atrium, obligatory heating, sewerage, if possible, water supply, wards for 5-6 people, separate operating rooms and warehouses for medicinal herbs, instruments and dressing material. The best preserved valetudinarium can now be seen in the town of Caerleon in Wales. The legions that settled in the province of Britain for a long time even erected extensive thermae at the hospital. The valetudinarium, as well as the whole army, was supplied centrally. The medical staff of the hospitals had the status of immune, that is, released from the mandatory for each soldier economic and construction work. It is known that in peacetime legionaries in the most literal sense of the word built the empire, roads, defense ramparts, cities. Professional, public physicians, whom we mentioned above, were called medicus ordinarius, and they were assisted by orderlies capsari, whose name came from the bag with a field kit, capsa. The instrumentary were responsible for material supplies, medicines, tools, wine, which was the basis of many medicines. General care for the wounded and sick was carried out most often by slaves. The hospital was headed by the chief physician, who was directly subordinate to the camp prefect or legion tribune. It should not be thought that despite the seemingly archaic nature of Roman medicine, the art of medicine was primitive or quackery. Both civilian and military physicians knew their business perfectly well. They knew medicinal anesthesia, preparations based on stupefying herbs. Archaeologists have found many sophisticated surgical instruments that are still in use today. probes for examining wounds, scalpels, catheters, clamps to stop bleeding from damaged vessels, and sutures. Celsus describes more than 100 different instruments, among them specialized ones, such as the tuphlagkistron found near the Macedonian legion's base in Moesia. This device was designed to extract arrowheads from wounds with minimal trauma to the wounded. Finally, the Romans had an idea of antisepsis. Doctors washed their hands and instruments with hot red wine, and ovens for sterilization have been found. The actions of medical personnel on the battlefield were standard. Cupseri, mounted orderlies, who led a small detachment of porters, either rendered first aid directly during the battle in the near rear, where the wounded were dragged, or immediately evacuated them to the hospital, where the injured were in the hands of surgeons. That is, even then the concepts of medical evacuation were already formed. The wounded in the hospital were given all possible help and care, and partial prosthetics, the same metal plates for skull injuries, were common. In case of successful treatment, the legionary returned to the ranks, and in case of disability his status was changed to medical demobilization, which gave exactly the same civil rights as the demobilization of honorable, by length of service. That is, a Roman who was medically discharged from the army was exempt from taxes and civil duties. Nevertheless, with all the organization and serious approach to military medicine, the chances of survival were far from everyone. The Roman structure of organization of military medicine was later inherited by Byzantium, which expanded the units of cupseri. These were already separate sanitary units of deputies, about 10 people per cohort, engaged exclusively in providing assistance on the battlefield and evacuation. Alas, but after the fall of Rome and with the onset of the Dark Ages, European medicine in the states created by barbarians on the wreckage of the empire fell back to a completely primitive state and began to revive somehow only by the High Middle Ages, and the antique heights reached in the New Age. However, the Great Rome created a sufficient theoretical basis, which descendants used for almost 1,500 years. The works of Galen, Celsus, Dioscorides, Cyranus of Cilicia and many other authors who guided doctors in later eras. The outstanding military medicine of the empire died with Rome, and its revival had to wait for many centuries.